So we want to welcome Victoria Martinez from Alamosa, Colorado, which is twice as high as Denver, so to speak, in the Colorado Plateau leading down to New Mexico. And maybe you can even give us a little geography to give us a sense of place. You're going to talk about your place, Victoria, but I so thank you for joining us. Tori, welcome. I don't want to go on and on, but I had the pleasure of meeting you in Alamosa, an unexpected and amazing experience in Alamosa. Some of your colleagues had come to one of our summer institutes, and then I was down in Alamosa, I think that was 2 years ago, and it's very, very cold there in the winter.
Yes, it is.
Yes, and there are other stories to tell, but I had such a wonderful experience there. I really, truly did. There was such a tremendous sense of community with folks in Alamosa, the educators where you're an alumni and you still have a lot of relationships at Adams State University, a small liberal arts, former teachers college that's quite special and unique and very focused on place-based education, which is why we all came together. And I got to know you and a number of your colleagues and had a truly deeply moving experience there. And also you all were, good enough to take me out and into the valley and show me your place. And I won't mention names, but I traveled around the valley and I just had a great time. Didn't want to leave, which is often the case when I'm in a special place. So I'll just introduce you. You're a veteran community storyteller. You're an ethnographer, social scientist. You've worked in areas of social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. You're a Jedi. That's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is a Jedi. You turned me on to that. I like that. And you're from a rural community, but you're of and about rural communities. Not to say that you wouldn't be excited to work in urban places. And you currently work as a community organizer for the Colorado Trust. So what did I miss? What do we need to know about you before we get to your personal background? You work for the Colorado Trust. You've done a lot of other things in your career.
Yeah. I'm living in a rural area right now, which is wonderful. And I absolutely enjoy being in nature. So this is like the perfect place for me right now. But yeah, I have been in a lot of urban settings as well. And I've worked in several different cities. So back and forth. But I think the Sunless Valley holds a special place in my heart. And I think home for everybody probably does that.
Home. So home is like a recurring central theme for you.
Yes, absolutely.
And in our conversation today, in this hour or so that we have, we're going to talk about, I think, your perceptions and your instincts, which I think I share, about how important that is for students to develop. And it's not an automatic thing to get that and feel that, okay?
Yeah, for sure, especially for students of color.
Especially. So why don't we start with, I don't want to pen you in with questions, but let's, or themes, but let's start with your personal background. I mean, I'm still trying to figure this out, so I don't have an answer if you ask me, but why do you care about this so much? This being place, storytelling, and all that goes with that, and having a sense of belonging.
So I think all of that started when I was really young with my grandparents, who were absolutely amazing people, both on my father's side and my mother's side. And my paternal grandparents were weavers. And my grandmother was the most amazing storyteller I have ever encountered in my life. And I've met quite a few storytellers over the years. but she had this quality about her that just totally drew you in to her stories. And that is storytelling is a cultural tradition in both my Native American families and my Hispanic family. And so it was just a natural part of our life to hear stories and tell stories and be engulfed in stories on a daily basis. And so that love of storytelling started like probably from the day that I was born. um, and for me, poetry is one of the most rhythmic and lyrical and powerful ways for me to share stories. And so I'll be sharing a few poems with everyone today. Um, as far as beyond the storytelling, as I got older and I did my undergraduate work at Adams State University and my graduate work at Arizona State University, my focus was on communities of color and really being able to capture their stories and empower the people living in those communities to be able to voice their own stories and be able to change their story. Because I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that we as humans have the ability to do. We all have stories. We have stories about our communities, about our families, and about ourselves that we are already at this moment telling ourselves. And one of the most powerful things that we can do is change our story. So if our story isn't that great, if we have a story of trauma, if we have a story of victimization, if we have a story of disempowerment or oppression, then we have it within our ability to change those stories. And one of the examples that I love the most is stories of our tribal people when we were fighting to protect the water. And there was a lot of stories being told in the media, and it wasn't how we as a Native people saw ourselves or felt that we were doing. And so we changed the stories. Instead of being protesters, we told our own story that we were water protectors. And so I think being able to change our stories, that's one of the most powerful things about storytelling, is that we have that ability and we have the power to do that. So one of the poems that I'd like to share with everyone to kind of start us off is about my grandmother. And so I mentioned a little bit about my grandparents earlier. And so this poem is called Grandmother. I watch the curl of her lips and the swing of her hips as she commands the room. It's the tone of her voice, the way she lifts her arms, the glimmer in her eyes that captivates you. Word after spoken word, she pulls you into her world, a world she creates right before your eyes using only her words. You are mesmerized by her every move, this modern Scheherazade. She spins a tale of old, a poem unfolds, a history remembered, her power, a treasure. The past, present, and future are all within reach, and it takes her but a moment to transport you there. With the flick of her hand or the change in her tempo, she moves you from darkness to light. She stands and you quiver. She moves towards you and you sigh. She's a giant among women, an owl in flight. She's a keeper of culture, a bringer of dreams. She's a force of nature, this storyteller. It's her long black hair flowing in the breeze. It's the sway of her brightly colored dress as she dances past you. It's the scent of the fields still resting on her breasts. It is all of that and what you cannot see that my grandmother onto me. So that's the poem about my grandmother. I think you're on mute, Joe.
That's beautiful, Tori. Your grandmother was like was she kind of the matriarch in the family?
She was, yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, and that's not a guaranteed anymore. So she moved the stories forward.
She did. She was definitely a keeper of culture.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm just saying, it's not something we can take for granted anymore. It, it, I'm not sure we ever could, but it did seem to be a valued thing that needs to be a little more reinforced and supported as we go forward. And it's also a given that the kids that we work with, the students that we come to meet, have not all had that experience. This is an off-track question, forgive me, but you've worked with students, you've worked with schools around the valley and the San Luis Valley, which is an awesome and amazing place, almost beyond time, as it spills down into New Mexico. And it was where I guess the Spanish first came up into Colorado. Am I right?
Yeah, I love the history of this place. So right now I am on the Apache, Ute, and Pueblo Nations land, and it is on the southern centralmost point of Colorado, so right on the state line with New Mexico. And we hear very often that this is a very mystic place. It's a very enchanting place. It's a place that easily and quickly seeps into people's hearts and spirits, and they find a connection here and very often end up staying or returning to visit on a regular basis because this place is just so special. And the history here is that this is all Native American land, and then the Spanish came and stole the land and occupied here for about 300 years. And then people in Mexico revolted, and they wanted to have the land back for themselves, and so they want it back from Spain, and so all of this territory became Mexico for about a generation. So it wasn't very long that this area was under Mexican identity. And then people came from the West, and there was Manifest Destiny that happened. And then this area became part of the United States. And so the many generations of people who have been here, as long as we can remember, have had a Native American identity, a Spanish identity, a Mexican identity, and now American. And so all of that without ever having crossed any borders. And that's one of the sayings that people have for this place is we never crossed the borders crossed us.
And I'm deeply lucky and fortunate to have been through that territory with Aaron. You know Aaron Abeda,
Mm-hmm.
and that small, tiny little town with a very great place to eat. I remember. You know where I'm talking about, and that this is all down on not to New Mexico, but getting very close to where the valley opens up into New Mexico. And then you go up to the top of the valley, and Alamosa, where you do a lot of work, is up at the top of the valley, right? Trying to give
Right.
people a picture. And
Geographically, the San Luis Valley is shaped like an arrowhead.
yeah,
And so Alamosa is like at the tip of the arrowhead.
and then you hit the Rockies,
Right.
right? And having done a bus ride over the spine of the Rockies, that's adventurous territory up there. That's pretty cool. So, but back to and then I had a sort of an area I wanted to follow up with you on, and definitely getting to some of the projects and storytelling you've done. But what do you find with typical kids? I don't know if we want to give them an age group, but with typical kids, what do you find the natural curiosity is at a starting point with knowing where they come from and where they are and what that all means?
Well, I think it doesn't really matter about their age in regards to interest. It just matters how you engage them, I think. But for the most part, regardless of age ranges, because I've worked with kids in varying age all the way up to college students. If you start with a place that is familiar with them, a place in the town or the city where they grew up, and you tell them a story about that place that they didn't know before, it piques their interest, and then they want to know more. And from there, you can go into stories about the community and stories about their families and stories about the history of that particular county or that particular state, wherever you find yourself. And I think if you kind of move in that order from very small, very local, very meaningful to at the bigger, broader picture.
So could I summarize that it ends up being about establishing a personal connection?
It does.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's gonna be, yeah.
one of the best quotes that I've ever heard about storytelling is that it doesn't matter how much truth or how many facts your story might have. What matters is whether or not the person hearing that story can find meaning in it.
Okay. So that kind of moves us along to why does, I mean, to some of us, this is obvious, and to others, semi-obvious, and others haven't thought about it yet. Can you talk a little bit about why storytelling? And then you've got oral histories, which I think, and then you're an ethnographer, and there's the whole ethnography process, which, as you know, matters a lot to both of us. And you've done great work. And maybe you could even throw out a definition of ethnography that won't chase people off. We do a lot of that work through Community Works Institute, trying to get teachers into it. But, oral ethnography is a pretty technical term for some people. And then you've got oral histories, which sounds pretty formal and sounds pretty frozen. I'm just saying, I cut my teeth when I had little or no idea what I was doing with middle school students in Vermont doing oral histories. But it sounds like a process that's frozen in time. You go out, you interview, you record, and there it is. And we'll get to the public audience thing later. But why does it matter? Let's take this in chunks. Why does it matter to do this work with students?
So at the very basic, stories are often told by the victors. And so if you think about the history books that we've all seen in our schools and we're exposed to, because it's the victor who writes the stories, automatically, most of the stories in our society are missing half of the picture.
At least.
And yeah, and there is a real danger in only knowing a single story. And whether that's a single story about yourself or your family or your community or your country. And I think we've kind of seen the danger in that, in what's playing out in our country right now, and the tensions that people are expressing and experiencing. And so it is important that we hear the full stories. So we need different perspectives. We need to hear all sides of the stories. So that's one thing. The other is that stories are not often told by people of color. And so we need more stories about people of color being told by people of color. And that's really essential for students at any age to be able to hear stories about someone who looks like them, and to know stories are out there in the world and in the universe about people who look like them. And so it's difficult for students to be what they've never seen. And so stories can help with that. And I think that's probably the two most essential things that are important about stories. I think that for people of color and for people who are bilingual, often feel like we are navigating between worlds, and that we're having to mimic the dominant culture in order to survive. And so that's become a survival strategy for people of color. And I don't think that would be necessary if our world was familiar and capable and in a place of hearing more than that single story. And so what I'd like to do is share another poem with all of you now. And this poem is twofold. So the first half of this poem is about places that people of color often occupy and what that feels like to be in those places as a person of color. So it might be a little jarring for some people, and it might resonate with others. And then the second half of this poem is about my ideal world that I really work towards. So the work that I do is really about moving towards this ideal world. And so this poem is called The Cultural Code Switching Chameleon. I am praised for code switching, told it's a talent, told it's a gift. Really, it's just a white, nice way of sweeping history under the rug. History of lost identities, traditions, through assimilation. They smile as my world slowly washes over with white waves of speaking, thinking, and being. It feels like becoming a chameleon, mimicking whiteness in order to blend in, ultimately perpetuating the status quo through this survival strategy. If for once the shoe shifted to the other foot and the power is really mine and ours, justice will be our lands returned, nature cared for, and decisions made with the next 7 generations in mind. Equity would look like freedom to fully be our colorful selves at all times. Diversity would show up in every boardroom, office, school, government, and community. Inclusion would be the act of including all abilities, languages, colors, sizes, ages, genders, and sexualities in the process of building a new world juntos. And for those who aren't familiar, juntos is a Spanish word that means together. And the last few stanzas of this poem actually spell out Jedi. So the first letter in each stanza spells out JEDI, which Jill mentioned earlier, stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so all of the work that I do, the things that I write, is really with a Jedi focus. I think you're on mute again, Jill.
I'm hoping you have a couple more of your poems. I truly do.
I do, yes. There are 2 more that I'd like to share as we move on.
It's a lot to unpack, and I want to invite. We have folks on our Community Works Institute Facebook page. Certainly comment. We're trying to kind of keep track. The comments are helpful. And if you have questions, and we're going to try to save some time for questions so that we can come back and zero in on questions folks may have. We're trying to move through the material, as you will, the many things that Tori has to share with us. And I think that, well, this whole idea of code switching that's a deep and complicated conversation. Not to mention, I would love to see code switching classes, because it seems to me, and I'm improvising here, that being able to code switch means a lot of things. And there's this whole idea of the overused term intersectionality, and just being able to move back and forth between, different places, people, spaces. Some of us, have experienced that, and the value of that is utterly huge. it seems to me, I'm improvising here, Tori. It seems to me it's about improvising sometimes. And you talked about dominant narrative, and you talked about, the stories that are untold, and how these stories can ultimately, in an ideal situation, come together in a way that respects all respectful stories. Do you want to riff on that a little bit?
Well, let me start by offering up, like you said, a couple of definitions. So for those who aren't familiar with that term, code switching, it is a term that is used to describe a person who can, like you mentioned, go back and forth between worlds. And so you can code switch between languages. You can code switch between how you would behave in your own community, especially a community of color, and how you would behave like in the business world or in an office setting. And so there's lots of different ways that people can code switch, and there are definitely benefits to that, but it is also a survival mechanism for people of color, because we feel like we have to do that in order to be able to survive in a world that really wasn't at times created for us or with us in mind. So there's a lot of like emotions to unpack around that. There's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of culture to unpack around that particular term. The other term you mentioned earlier was ethnography. And that's a very academic term for something that is quite beautiful and quite simple at times. And ethnography is really just immersing yourself in a community or in a culture or in a group of people, and really just connecting on a human level with those people in that community. Or if it's a school setting, like really connecting with your students and doing that through what Joe mentioned as interviews. And I've never really liked that term, but for lack of a better term, it's good at describing what ethnographers do. And it's really having, I guess another way to describe it would be one-on-one conversations. And so you sit down with someone and you start a conversation and you start talking about what matters. And in the work that I do, and we'll get into some of the projects that I've worked on a little bit later, but in the work that I have done in having those conversations, and most of the conversations that I have are what I call semi-structured. And so I'll prepare myself and I'll prepare some questions before I go and talk to someone. And based on their answers, we can deviate from like my set of questions, or we can expand on those particular questions and just really get to know people. One of the projects that comes to mind when I talk about this is the Voices del Valle, or Voices of the Valley project. And ethnography and ethnographic interviews was a huge part of that project. And so I got to speak with elders in our community and ask them, what does this place mean to you? What is your connection to this land, to the water, to the mountains, to the people that live here? And what makes it difficult to live in this place? And what makes it wonderful to live in this place? And why has your family been here for 7 generations or longer? And conversations like that can lead to a lot of things. And we interviewed, I would say, over 100 people. And each interview lasted around 4 hours. And so it was some really deep conversations that we had with people. And I say we because I had a research partner, Dr. Benwell, who was amazing with this project. And I say we because it also involved students. And some of them were middle school students, some of them were high school students, and some of them were college students. And so that was an amazing, amazing project that I absolutely loved. And that was a 5-year span. And so that was a 5-year project. And a couple of things came from that project. And I hope you're okay with me moving on to the next kind of topic, Joe. But
move on. Well, don't move too far on, but go for it, Tori.
So one of the things that came from that project was that not all, but a lot of the interviews were recorded. And so we were able to really capture the nuances of this very unique language that exists in what we call the Upper Rio Grande region. And that includes northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. And so there is a unique Spanish spoken here and nowhere else in the world. And it's a Spanish that has come from a mixture of cultures and a mixture of words used in Native American languages, in Spanish, by the Mexican indigenous people, and that has evolved over the years. And so, yes, it is a Spanish dialect, but it is a very unique Spanish dialect. And so we were able to capture some of the nuances of how people speak that dialect here in the Sunless Valley and the words that are used. And so that was one of the most beautiful aspects about the work that we did, is just being able to hear people speaking the language and capture that on film. And so one of the clips that I want to show to all of you very briefly, it's just like a minute and a half, but this is a clip from an interview I did with Lillian Gomez. And she was a local educator who had taught in primary education, secondary education, and we were talking about her childhood and what it was like growing up in this place as a woman of color. And we were talking about language, and at the time, the difficulties of dealing with being bilingual. So let me bring up this clip, and then after we watch it, we can talk a few minutes about Lillian. So hopefully you can all hear it. Joe, let me know if for some reason the sound isn't coming through.
I think we're fine.
So going into kindergarten and not knowing the word in English was frightening. And so I know that I watched the teacher at every moment. If she turned her face to me, or I couldn't see the words that were coming out of her mouth or her expressions, my understanding completely in English was diminished. We were at a time that Spanish was not allowed to be spoken in K-12 schools, right? So I was told very young that if they caught me speaking Spanish at school, I would be charged 50 cents for every word of Spanish that I spoke. So it really silenced me as a young child, right? Because I very quickly did the math and said, oh my goodness, my father only earns $2 a day. A complete sentence will diminish my family's resources. I can't do that. So I remember really being silenced and continuing to learn the language. But by the time I hit 6th or 7th grade, I was a pretty fluent English speaker.
So Lillian was in the education system at the time when desegregation was happening. And it was really, in our particular community, it was really about combining white students and Hispanic students. And at that time, they were attending different schools. And she's, in this particular video clip, she's talking about her own childhood experiences and growing up in a time when she wasn't allowed to speak Spanish. And so that had a profound effect on her. And I'm sorry if that was triggering for anyone, but that definitely had a profound effect on her. And luckily, Lillian was one of the people in the Valley who was able to keep her Spanish language. So in spite of the experiences that she had going to school, she really held on to that language and was able to keep it. That was not the case for everyone, however. And so for an entire 2 generations in the Valley, the language was really lost in some families. And that was the case in my family. And it was a survival mechanism that the language wasn't passed on because of the traumas that people experienced here, and what people were going through. And it's something that now, like, the younger generation is really excited about reclaiming their language and getting that power back and being able to speak the language again. And I think that's the case in a lot of Native American communities as well, is really wanting to pass the language, the tribal languages, on to the next generation so the languages aren't lost. And that's really critical. And that's a part of stories that need to be told. And it's one of the concepts that I really, truly believe in with all my heart and soul. And it's something that luckily the organization that I work for right now, the Colorado Trust, believes in as well. And so we, in whatever we are doing, will offer interpretation in people's heart language. And that's the language that is most precious to them, often their first language, the language that they prefer to communicate in and speak in. And Lillian is kind of just referring to that in this very brief clip. If you want to watch the entire clip, the entire interview with Lillian, it's about 45 minutes. And there's a ton of other videos available on my YouTube channel. And the name of the YouTube channel is called Rethinking Rural Women. So if you just go onto YouTube and you put that in the search.
Can you pop that into the,
Yeah, let me see if I can.
and I'll try to be really good about putting that into the Facebook feed as well.
Okay, I'm going to pop it into the chat right now. So this is the link to my YouTube channel, and you can watch all of the other ethnographic interviews that we have done that are available on that particular
Because
channel.
you did the, oh, there's so many things I want to ask you about. So you did the, you did Voces de Valle, right? And then,
Yeah, Voices de Valle, and that's Lillian is part of that project.
right? And the forgive me, I'm forgetting the name. There was another organization that you worked with, and you've done a lot of oral histories in the Valley.
I have, yeah, it's just amazing. So one of the other, briefly, that I'll mention is Exploring Our Roots. And that is a summer project that I did with middle school and high school students. And they explored the roots of their families in their particular communities. And so in that instance, I actually trained them to be the ethnographers. And they were the ones who went into the community, did the interviews and talked with the elders and talked with their families. And we trained them on how to work the video camera equipment and how to edit and do the entire process from beginning to end and put it up on YouTube. And so you can see the videos that they created as well. Those are also available on that YouTube channel. And you can see their community presentation. So it's called Exploring Our Roots. And they did an amazing job. They were super nervous at first to present to a huge community, but they did an amazing job, and they pushed back their fears, and they presented their video clips to their family, their friends, and the elders in their community to share with them what they had learned doing this summer project. And then the other project that I'll mention that was one of my favorites was our teachers' workshops, which may pertain a lot to this group in particular. And those workshops were in collaboration with the University of Colorado in Boulder. And they have a Latino history project. And were kind enough to work with me and my community and create some lessons for our local teachers. And so in those teachers workshops, we brought in local teachers K through 16, and we took them on local field trips. They got to see some historic places, some historic buildings, and then culminating at the end of that, we're able to create some lessons plans. And so what I'm going to do now is put a link in the chat. And this is the link to the Latino History Project at CU Boulder. And this particular link that I put in the chat is for their lesson page. And so anybody who's interested in having free access to some actual lesson plans, you can visit that website, click on that link, and a whole array of different themed lesson plans come up. The other is with the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area. And so I was the executive director at that organization for a time, and also did some teachers workshops with them and created some really amazing lesson plans as well. And so I will put that in the chat. That way you can visit those lesson plans as well. And they're all freely available, different theme lesson plans. And I think they're really versatile. So you can adjust them for your particular community, your particular city or state, and be able to kind of just tweak them the way that you need to be able to use them like tomorrow in your classrooms or community settings.
I mean, at the risk of being obvious, the thing that occurs to me is that while, you know, those of us that are interested in culture and place in broader ways can, you know, immediately hook into the work you've done in the San Luis Valley, and, you know, for these, you know, kids who so much need a sense of place and value, etc. This could just as easily be done in Roxbury or South Boston or the Bronx or some other, name an urban setting. I'm trying to deliberately shift it to the urban. And
yeah, absolutely. They're very versatile lesson plans, and ethnographic work and storytelling work is very versatile no matter where you are. I mean, it's just all about connecting with your community, whatever that community may be. And it doesn't have to be a place. It can be a community of people, whether that is your students or your community or your church group or an LGBTQ community. Like, so community has a lot of different meanings. So whatever your community is, storytelling and the lessons that I provided you in these resources are very versatile for whatever you think of as community. And bringing up community, that's the work that I'm doing now, is in community. And I'm working as a community organizer for the Colorado Trust. And so the Colorado Trust is a health equity foundation. And so the work that I do is really rooted and grounded in involving those who are most impacted by inequities and empowering them and giving them the resources that they need to be able to define what their issues are and define what solutions that they want to implement to address those issues. And so it's amazing work, but it's also difficult work. It's emotional work. And so one of the last poems that I'd like to share with all of you is really about that kind of work. And I refer to that work in this poem as the wilderness, because it can be some difficult work. And so this poem is called Brave Souls. We venture into a vast wilderness with the desire to find the beauty of equity powerful enough to take our breath away. To start this journey, we must be brave, for this wilderness is as dangerous as it is wondrous. And what we must realize is that to be brave also means we must be vulnerable. In this vast wilderness, together, we can form authentic connections and a sense of true belonging. We can dare to share stories that lead to new levels of intimacy. In doing so, relationships can develop, collaborations can form, and we can build bridges to connect individuals, families, and communities. Connections powerful enough to create ripples upon the waters of change that will be felt even in the marble halls. There is a time for the power of silence when we stand strong as our mountains in solidarity. There is a time to plan and prepare, to educate and inform, to build up the strength we need to venture into that vast wilderness. And there is a time to rise as leaders and take action, to rejuvenate the next generation so that they take comfort and don't lose hope. The time is here. The time is now, and the wilderness is calling to all of you brave souls.
Tori, wow. I'm absorbing all of that. It's just, okay, I'm not going to shower you with more accolades. Listen, we're going to make this available later as a recorded video. We didn't get to everything we wanted to get to, but we got to some great stuff. And, you know, I know you had another poem you were going to share. I'm sort of skimming over some of my notes here and thinking about what we talked about talking about, which we mostly did. I'm interested quickly, and we need to wrap up, the where I'm from question.
Mhm.
Isn't that's a really interesting, much deeper than one thinks kind of question.
It is. So to kind of wrap things up, I think, Joe, you were kind of hoping, and hopefully I was able to give some resources that will be helpful. But as one step moving into storytelling, if you've never tried it before, people have talked about the I am poem, and that's been done a lot. But what I really love and I think is more impactful is writing a where I'm from poem. And I think because it really gets people thinking about their past, about their families, um, about really giving meaning to the stories that they tell about themselves and their communities. And so if anyone wants to email me, and Joe, you can stick my email in the chat, I can send you a quick lesson plan that I've prepared. Whether it's going to be in a community setting or in a classroom setting, you can use this type of lesson plan to really help people write a where I am from poem. And it talks you through like what you need to think about first, the different format of writing this poem, and just really how to make it beautiful. And I think it helps connect with community members and with students in a really special way. So very briefly and very quickly, I will share my last poem with you so you can all kind of get a feeling of what where I am from poem can sound like and what kind of information it can share and start conversations. I am from brown dirt and red clay. I am from the acequias flowing with life-giving water from the top of the mountain above the tree line of green pines to the valley floor of alfalfa fields. I am from my abuelita's cocina, filled with the aromas of tortillas y frijoles, and from my mama's garden of peas and papas. I am from the mighty river where La Llorona cries for the loss of her children, her language, her culture, and her home. I am from the painted canvas of Apache feathers and Ute necklaces that adorn my mother's mother, whose eyes are filled with sadness and hold many secrets. I am from the corn mothers before me, the givers of life, the dreamers of dreams, the dancers and painters, the writers and maestras, the sculptors that portray the essence of la femenino y las mujeres. So that's just a sample of like the information that you can gather and the conversations that can be started from an I am poem,
Well,
where I'm from.
it's a lot more than a sample of information. It's like the essence of you. Thank you. Tori, lastly, you know, what would you suggest? You know, this whole idea of going out and gathering stories, whether you're using iPhones, video cameras, or some other kind of thing, we or TikTok. Hey, I don't know that much about TikTok. Maybe we need to know about TikTok. What this is not an intimidating process. It should not be an intimidating process. It's you just have to start somewhere.
Right.
In stories. And maybe you start with your own story, like you're a 8th grade, 12th grade, high school sophomore, and here's my story on TikTok. I need to investigate TikTok, I confess. And here's my story. And then what about somebody else's story? And this is not an intimidating process. It should not be. Right?
No, I mean, it's a really a process of connection, and we all desire human connection. Like that's how we were built. We are social beings, and we were built for conversations with other people. And especially if it's easier if it's a one-on-one conversation. Typically, I will take 2 people with me, so it'll be me and one other person. And the reason I do that is because sometimes when you're having a conversation, it can go into very emotional places. And sometimes a person just needs a break. And so it's good to have two people there to recognize that and be able to provide space so that people can breathe and just live in their emotions for a little while and then be able to be pulled out of those emotions. I mean, like the clip that we saw with Lillian was deeply emotional and very powerful. And so when you're in that moment, it's easier just to have two people. So I'd make that a practice, is to have two people go out into the community when I'm doing these type of ethnographic interviews.
That's great advice. I had the very strange metaphor picture appear before me of like almost like a gondola kind of thing where you've got the person. You need two people. I get that. I think we don't really have time to totally unpack that, but that's a whole nother topic. The idea of the technical aspects of doing oral histories, interviews, it's not a technical process. That's not what it's about. But at the end of the day, it becomes, as we all have found, accidentally and otherwise, incredibly important to do a semi-professional job of recording it, because you get what you get. And then you're gone and you got what you got.
Mm-hmm.
And you may be the only one that, you know, I'm not going to story tell, but I mean, I did interviews with students with these Vermont, I don't know, rural farm folks, and they all remember to a day when electricity arrived in 1931, and they're absolutely, every one of them is gone now. And we may have been the only people that interviewed these folks, but you get what you get, and you better take care of it and treasure it and find a way to public audience. That's our closing thing. We're a little over time. How important is public audience? Because if it just sits on your own hard drive somewhere, who cares? It's a personal process.
Sometimes that's good enough. It just depends. I mean, the people who are actually listening and learning, it can be incredibly powerful and life-changing for them. But thinking about a public audience later on, you can write notes on a notebook, which I don't encourage, but it's doable. You can take a little video audio recording device, which are fairly inexpensive nowadays, or your cell phone. Most cell phones have a recording option on one of their apps, and you can record it that way, or video on your cell phone, which isn't the best, but then there are some better cell phones out there now that have great video quality. So whatever your tools of trade happen to be that you have available to you, you can make it work.
Yeah. And ultimately, ideally, if you're doing the work, you're doing something that you think is important. And the corollary to that is that ideally there would be a way to archive that, and that it would be available down the road. I guess that's.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that other than the videos we did, was Ben and I wrote a book. And so anyone who's interested, you're probably going to see this backwards, but
Hold that steady so we can see the title.
It might be backwards on the screen depending, but it's called the Geology, Ecology, and Human History of the San Luis Valley. And this was a collaborative effort with 22 authors, and each author wrote one chapter in this book. And so my chapter is chapter 15, and it's about the work that I did, Ben and I did, doing those oral histories and what we learned from that. And so if you're interested in that, you can pick the book up on Amazon, or Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore.
Tori, I come back to you and I thank you. You're awesome.
Thank you for including me in this spotlight series with all these other amazing change makers. I'm honored.
Just a great.
Thank you to everybody who listened in today and who's going to watch this video later.
You're a great resource, and everything you do is so from the heart. So I hope folks will connect with you. And and we'll talk soon. So that's it for now. I thank everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Tori.
Thank
You
you.
meant it from the heart.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.